Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for coming to this event, which is High Reliability Organizations Making It Real. This is a joint effort between the University of Queensland's Sustainable Minerals Institute, the AusIMM Southern Queensland branch, and the AusIMM Health and Safety Society. So thank you for those of you who've joined us here in person, as well as those of you online as well. So we've got an exciting lineup of speakers for you tonight. So I'll introduce the first one now. We'll start with a few, some short presentations by them, and then we'll move into the panel discussion portion of it. So first up is Susan Johnston, and Susan is the program leader of SMI's Governance and Leadership in Mining Strategic Research Program. She spent several decades working to improve mining industry safety and health, chairing major safety inquiries, holding global and national senior safety positions within industry, and advising governments on safety and health issues. Susan.
Thank you, Nikki, and good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So the title of today's forum is High Reliability Organisations Making It Real, and that's really where I want to start my presentation. There's a lot of theory, there's been a lot of discussion. My focus today is on what individuals and organisations can do in practical terms to build off that theory and those discussions and make it real. So I think, as everybody's well aware, ever since the Queensland Government Commission report into fatalities, there's been a lot of discussion about high reliability organisations, and that's because that report recommended indeed that organisations should consider adopting those principles. But I think what's happened in the course of this discussion is that people have grabbed the components of high reliability organisational thinking that they are most familiar with and most comfortable with and run with those, and not necessarily stopped and propped, not necessarily thought about what is this theory all about? What does it encompass? What do I need to understand? As the slide says, yes, in part, it's about things like incident reporting, but that's not enough. That doesn't drive you towards high organisational reliability of itself. Yes, it's helpful to not be complacent. It's helpful to be thinking all the time about what can go wrong, but that's not enough to drive you to high reliability. Some people have gone out there and said, okay, if I just re-examine what I'm doing on critical controls, surely that makes me a more highly reliable organisation. It's a component and it helps, but it's not enough. So what I'm going to say to you today is there are two things that I think that every organisation needs to do in this space. The first is fully understand the concept before you head off in a particular direction. And the second is understand what your starting point looks like, because it will be different for different organisations. Now, I'm told this now works, and let's hope it does. Oh, it does. So just to briefly recap, high reliability organisational theory, what is it? Well, the researchers 20 odd years ago talked about organisations that acted and thought differently, that had a collective sense of purpose, a collective mind. And within that broad cohesion that tried to achieve 5 things. One thing that's certainly happened in the last few months is people run off with the 5 principles, as you can see them up there on the screen. They don't think about the broader context. And the broader context was central to the research. It was all about, it's a kind of organisation. It's a broad approach. Within that broad approach, you do these several specific areas of activity. I think the component that everybody really ran with was preoccupation with failure, right? If we focus on that and once again channel it down into familiar territory like incident reporting, we'll be okay. But it's worth remembering that the original researchers, in particular Wyke and Sutcliffe, and they are the ones most commonly quoted, were just as interested, if not more so, in the other principles. So sensitivity to operations, for example, is equally as useful and important when you're thinking about reliability as preoccupation with failure. And yet almost nobody is out there talking about that particular principle and how you assess where you're at in relation to it. I think if you only focused on preoccupation with failure, and Wyke and Sutcliffe originally called that tracking small failures, right? If you only focused on tracking small failures, well, that would be helpful. But what you need to do is work out how you fix the problems that cause the small failures in the first place. And that's the problem with our current lens. We are focused on almost like a symptomatic response. We need to think about what drives these things to occur and address the problem, if there is a problem, at its source. So my starting point here is, okay, understand broadly what HRO thinking is really all about, and then understand where to start from. And the baseline assessment, again, I think is a fairly neglected component of how we're talking about high reliability organisations, but it's a critical component because every organisation will be different. The weaknesses and the strengths will not be the same from one to the other. I mean, you may have a situation where deference to expertise, which is really all about listening to the people who know the most about the work. I mean, really listening to them. If they say something, thinking about it and acting on it. For some organisations, that'll be the weak spot. And for others, it will be something else. And until you've mapped out what your current state of play is, there is really not a great lot of value herring off in any particular direction. Can that be done? It can. And it can be done, I think, in probably several different ways. But we would suggest that there are some questions, some core questions that whatever methodology you use, you need to be able to answer to give you the evidence base, which you can say, okay, I've mapped myself against sensitivity to operations or deference to expertise, and this is where I'm currently standing at. So what's on the slide and what's on the screen are some of the questions that I would suggest you need to have an answer to on sensitivity to operations before you can form a view about your current state of play. As you can probably work out, I'm not suggesting that you do an audit, and I'm not suggesting that you do a safety culture survey. It is a different kind of an exercise, and I think that's appropriate because we're after some new information. We're not after the same stuff that we already got before. This is a different exercise. Conscious of my 5 minutes. Yeah. This is an industry that loves a good journey model. So what I'm going to say to you now is, yes, there's a journey model in this conversation, but it's your journey model. It's the journey model that is pertinent to the organisational circumstances that you have. So the journey model for an organisation with weaknesses in the area of deference to expertise will not look the same as a journey model which is focused on preoccupation with failure. But that's how we have to start to think about this, as a tailored exercise genuinely focused on higher reliability. I think I'll possibly just finish up, Nikki, by saying whichever journey model is constructed in your set of circumstances, there is one consistent element, one thing that you're always going to need, and that is committed, engaged, listening leadership, which is my cue to pass over to Alex.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I'm going to say a few words. I'll hand it back now.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Our second speaker tonight is Alex Haslam, and Alex is Professor of Social and Organizational Psychology and Australian Laureate Fellow at the University of Queensland. His research focuses on the study of group and identity processes in organizational, social, and health contexts, and this has been recognized with a range of major awards from scientific bodies in Australia, the US, UK, and Europe. Together with his colleagues, he has published over 300 peer-reviewed articles and 15 books in these areas, including, most recently, The New Psychology of Health, Unlocking the Social Cure, and The New Psychology of Leadership, Identity, Influence, and Power. Alex?
Thank you very much. Great. So, yeah, I'm just going to really pick up from where Susan kind of left off. Because we're on the same journey together here, I think, and hopefully it's one that makes sense to you. Just to say that I work with a team of organisational social psychologists at the University of Queensland in the School of Psychology. Up until, maybe 3 years ago or something, I'd never really heard of a high reliability organisation. It turns out we'd been researching them all our lives, we just didn't know it. But it was a very happy kind of meeting with people from the SMI, particular Susan, to kind of bring our knowledge base together and bring our knowledge to bear on the kind of issues in this space. What we really wanted to do in the work that we've done to address the issues is come at it from a different perspective and provide a very different lens to the one that's traditionally provided to address these issues. If you look at the literature on HROs, there's really copious amounts of research saying what an HRO looks like. So descriptive work saying these are the characteristics of an HRO, like as Susan talked about. But actually, if you look at Wyke and Roberts' work, and they were social and organizational psychologists like us, they were less concerned with that and much more interested in general issues of process and the question of how you become an HRO. And notwithstanding the fact that that's the question that pretty much everybody wants to have answered, like presumably that's why you're here online, that's why you're in the room, that's the one on which most of the literature, most of the products that are out there are curiously mute. One thing I can tell you, and this is kind of, I guess, a basic lesson of the sort of approach to social psychology that my colleagues and I advocate for, and research on leadership, is you are absolutely never going to get there by simply having a better checklist. If you think that just coming up with prescriptive sets of actions that you need to be doing and checking that you do them every day or every hour or whatever is going to get you there, it absolutely isn't. You know, as Churchill said, we didn't win the Second World War by having a better checklist, okay? He never said that, but he might have done if he had been in there. So the HRO literature gives us a good sense of what a relevant manual needs to contain, if you like, but little sense of how you get there, and more particularly, how you get your organization to be in that space and to engage with the kind of deeper messages of high reliability. And a key point, and if you, whatever the, as I said, we've done research in high reliability organizations for a long time now, whether it be hospitals or research institutes or Air Service Australia or different kinds of organizations, the House of Parliament in the UK. The key to high reliability is doing high reliable things because they are central to what you are about as an organization. If you think about Qantas, why is safety, why have they got such a good safety record? It's because they understand safety to be absolutely central to who they are as an organization. End of story. So it's something that informs everybody's shared sense of social identity. What it means to work for Qantas is to be interested in safety, in the same way as what it means to work for your organization is X, Y, and Z. And if safety isn't one of those things, it's unlikely that you're ever going to get to a space where you're actually behaving in a highly reliable way. Again, just to take you through the high reliability literature and what it actually says, as opposed to the ways in which you might have been led to understand it. If you look at what the sort of high priests of that literature have suggested, they really argue that we need to focus on people, not just technology. It's really interesting. One of the projects that we're working on at the moment is going through the major reports of the major accidents that have been in Australia over the last 20 or 30 years, Mauer and so on. And what you see there is that those reports start by saying this is a social, human problem. Things went wrong with the way these teams were operating, the way they were managed. And it ends up with a whole lot of technological and sort of physics-based recommendations. Technology is not the solution. It's part of it, but if you think you're going to get there just by having better technology, you're absolutely wrong. If you don't take your people on the journey to engage with that technology properly, you will never be a highly reliable organization. This is down to the fundamental element of successful resilience is people, and the redesign of organizational systems and interfaces should focus on facilitating the re-engineering around human factors rather than mechanistic inorganic ones. The second point, and this is really comes from the work of Wyke, is a lot of the focus is on systems or individuals, but actually the research suggests that a lot of what goes on in safety and what's critical is happening in groups and teams at the coalface, as it were. So you need to focus not just on people's identity as individuals, but their identities as members of a group. What does it mean to be a member of this team or this organization? This is Wyke and Roberts. A well-developed and healthy organizational mind capable of reliable performance is thoroughly social. It is built of ongoing interrelating and dense interrelations. As people move towards individualism and fewer interconnections, organization mind is simplified and becomes indistinguishable from individual mind. And with this change comes heightened vulnerability. The key point there is if you have an atomized workforce who are not plugged into a collective understanding of problems and solutions, again, that way disaster lies. So practically, an organization that aspires to be an HRO, and this is basically where we're coming at this from a social identity perspective, is it needs to identify and work with the relevant social identities of employees. Who are we? What are we about? What do we care about? What matters to us? What are the things that we're trying to achieve in this space? In that context, those groups need to develop and promote reliability enhancing group norms so that safety becomes part of what we are about. You also need to have behaviors that reward, and I mean in a very general sense, groups and collectives, not just individuals, for reliability enhancing behavior. So really the group needs to be the focus of your attention, not just individuals. And we need to ensure that there's genuine embedded commitment to safety on the part of leaders at every level in the organization, not just the people at the top or the people at the middle, the people, the leaders, the informal leaders within every team. So your leadership needs to be about high reliability, and people need to be doing it because they believe in it, not because it's something that they're being forced to do, otherwise they'll lose their job or they'll get struck off or whatever it is. Okay, they do it because they think it's the right thing to do. What you see in organizations that are moving towards high reliability on that journey that Susan talked about is that they recognize that there's a gap between the organization that we are, the team that we are, and where we want to be. And really the leadership in this space is all about negotiating that gap. And our work, most of our work is on leadership in this and other contexts, really argues leadership is absolutely critical. But leadership itself is a social identity process. It's about creating, advancing, creating and embedding a shared sense of social identity built around high reliability. And just to end, the current work that we're doing is at one level it's theoretical, but it's also practical, about translating that into a practical program whereby organizations can work in a meaningful way towards high reliability. Again, you're never going to get there with a better checklist. I've said it once, I'll say it again. It's so true. In fact, all the checklist tells you is you've got a problem, and it's probably going to get worse if you think this is the solution. Okay. So you start with understanding, this is what Susan said. Who are we? What are we about as a team, as an organization? Look at identity strength. Look at the alignment between the identities of your team and other ones. Look at the content of your identity, what you're about. Then ask, what is it that we want to be as a team? Where do we want to go? Again, what do we want to cohere around? Okay, so again, where do we want to go in this space? Do we want to make safety more important to what we're doing? Do we want to be more committed to reducing certain types of activity and increasing others? Well, of course, the obvious point is unless you really believe that you want to get to that space, you never will, okay? So the first thing is that you have to have those high reliability aspirations. The second thing is you also then need to step back and look at the structural realities that you confront. If you look at the Mara report and the detail of it, the reality was there was all manner of structural problems that were stopping people doing the sensible things that needed to be doing. There were people who were filing reports that weren't being read. Why? Because they were filing reports because they had to file reports. Okay, well, again, they just had a good checklist, didn't get them anywhere. Okay, so again, I've made that point, you've got it, okay? So, but there are structural realities there too, is the thing, and often those structural realities get in the way of you doing the things that you need to do and that you kind of want to do. And then the final piece of the jigsaw is really the leadership piece, the identity leadership piece, which is saying, what will we as a group do to get from who we are to where we want to be in the face of the structural realities that we kind of confront. And we're in the process of adapting some of the stuff that we've done with different industries here in Australia, but also around the world. As I said, we've just done a big project with the House of Parliament in the UK to really look at actually how you can take leaders down that development journey, focus them on the right questions, the right processes, the ways to work practically with their teams to climb the various mountains, the various challenges that high reliability presents. As I say, I think that's a very different way of thinking about high reliability. It's a very different way of thinking about leadership. But if you look at a deep level at what the real lessons of Wycombe Roberts and all of the research in this space is telling you, and if you look at the success stories in this space, you see that this is absolutely integral to what they were about. And if you're interested in high reliability, it has to be absolutely integral to what you and your organization are about.
Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker is Bobby Foote. Bobby is the head of Health, Safety and Environment for BHP Mitsubishi Alliance. She has almost 20 years leading sustainability improvement in the mining industry across multiple commodities and jurisdictions. Bobby's also a current member of COMSHAC, the Coal Mining Safety and Health Advisory Committee, and co-chairs the Minerals Industry Safety and Health Center Advisory Board at SMI. Bobby.
Thanks, Nikki, and I'm pleased to be here and talk about this. So firstly, I'm going to show you my checklist, and I just want to see the look on Alex. There's no checklist. What I was asked to talk about and go through is the way that BMA has approached this. And this is an example. It's not a recipe. As Susan said, each organisation will be different, have quite different context. And I don't think that you can just plug and play. So just wanted to talk through our journey, which is still ongoing, and where we're up to on that as well. So I think prior to high reliability organisations showing up in the Brady report and getting discussed around the industry a couple of years ago, we were already working towards some of the high reliability organisation principles, some quite deliberately, like chronic unease and preoccupation with failure was already something that we spoke about and built into things like critical control systems and so forth. Other things we were far less deliberate about, but when we actually stopped and looked, we realised we've been working on some of these things, a bit like what Alex said, we just didn't call it that. And then there were other things that we probably hadn't thought deeply enough about either. Some of our programs that we already had actually had high reliability organisation principles designed into them, probably by accident from that side, maybe a little bit on purpose. So things like our field leadership program, which is an in-field safety engagement and verification program, had some of those core elements, and we'll talk about that when we get to the mapping. Material risk and critical control systems, investigation methodologies had started to look at some of those principles as well. And we'd also done some other specific work in our organisation on psychological safety, and that's ongoing. And that has helped lay a bit of a foundation on the leadership side as well. In the last little while, we've started a more deliberate mapping exercise, which I'm pleased to say is what Susan suggested we should do, so that's great. So looking at our BMA systems, processes, culture and activities against those HRO principles. And I think that's a core piece. Is the first step is, what is your system, and your system as a whole? So I'll use that term quite broadly. I'm not talking about just what's written down, but what is it actually intending to develop? So what is that work as designed, work as intended? What are you teaching people in your leadership programs? What are you telling people in inductions? How are you responding to incidents? What's your system like, and your reporting system, et cetera, and all of those things, having a look at, if we implement it as designed, which we'll come to in a minute, is it actually going to drive us in the right direction, or is it heading us in the wrong direction? Are there elements of the system that contradict each other and are pulling against each other, for example? So that's that first piece of actually doing that mapping and really looking then at mapping things out and then looking at how well things are integrated as well. And I'm going to show you an example, not because it will be particularly useful to you, but it just gives you some idea of how we've gone about that exercise. This isn't necessarily how you should do it. You should look at what are the core elements. You'll have different things in it, and that's completely fine as well. I think one of the things that I would say, since we did this and the process of doing this, we've learnt quite a lot as well. I would say that the map that I'm going to show you is definitely imperfect. So And I think that that's just the nature of the process as well. So our different systems and programs and so forth, we've mapped them against a particular principle. Well, we just put it there because it was the one that it's most related to. It actually, a number of these programs actually go across several principles, and actually it should if we've got a well-integrated system as well. So I will show you the example, then we'll look at, you know, how we're going to apply it, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Point in the right direction. So obviously just looking at, you know, what are the principles and trying to understand those. Then we've had a look at, you know, what's our overall charter, what's our overall purpose, so that collective purpose that Alex spoke about, how does that fit in? Is it actually heading us in the right direction? Is safety there, for example? If safety is not even one of our charter values, then we've probably got a problem straight away. Then we've looked at, so we have things that we call our requirements. So these are some of those core standards, if you like, that go across BHP, and how do they actually work? What are some of our systems, like how we manage our work management systems, etc. You know, what are our organisational design principles, etc. What is our leadership program doing? You know, what kinds of things are we teaching people within that? What are we doing with contractor management, etc., etc. Then we have a system called the BHP operating system, which has been in development probably over the last 5 years. And that might seem like a strange time to start that, given BHP's been going for quite a long time, but it really is actually a consolidation and a mapping along those same lines. So you'll see that actually each of those BHP operating system practices actually does work to each one of these. And so one of the things, and it has whole training and deployment and supporting approach. So it includes things like how we manage our metrics, how we balance capacity and demand and things like that, how we lead people, what routines are in place, etc. And it's actually trying to get a lot more consistency across that. So you can see that it actually maps into each one of those. So this is all just design. It's not necessarily application, as we said as well. Then we get into our risk architecture and where does that show up from frontline task-based risk assessment all the way through to our risk reports that are going to the board of BHP and how we're doing capital allocations and all of those sorts of things. So there's quite a lot of elements. You're not expected to read all this. This is just kind of giving you some idea of some of the things that you start to think about when you try to actually map this as well. What does our time in field look like in the sensitivity to operations? How much time are people really getting in field? How are we designing it? Are we designing it so that supervisor can't really do more than 10% of their time in field, or are we doing that the other way around, for example? What about crisis and emergency management? What about when things go wrong, etc.? What are our procedures for that, etc.? Investigation methodology. I'm not going to cover everything. I'm just giving you a few examples here as well. And then a couple of things that are sort of specific to our Queensland industry. So, which is why that sort of came in last, is the BMA processes, because there's a whole BHP framework, and then there's some things that are quite specific where we're learning from local events, looking at SHMSs, etc. from that side. So that process is just actually looking at what do you actually have in your system to start with. Let's map it out. Then let's have a look at, go into those documents and say, well, does that actually help, or is that actually working against it? So, you know, in contractor management, for example, if you're trying to, in one part, and I know we said reporting isn't the whole game for sure, but if you're trying to increase reporting and you've got a contract that says, if you have a near miss, you know, we're going to penalise you or have a disincentive, then you're not going to get good reporting. So where are the different parts working against each other? So that's kind of that first stage. The next step for us then is to test how well are we really applying this. So what is the work as normal? What actually happens versus what we've actually got designed? And we know, because it's not a perfect system and so forth, that we're going to be deploying those things, you know, in some cases well, in some cases not so well, in some cases they'll be on a journey. And then having a look at, you know, what are those most critical bits? Where would we get the most benefit from improving that as well? So we'll get more into some of that in some of the questions and so forth, no doubt, in examples. But I did want to take this moment to sort of talk about a few of the reflections that we've had on the process of doing this. So I think that, you know, there's an output here and that looks great, but it doesn't really mean anything unless you're actually going and implementing it. The process of going through this mapping exercise has meant that we've engaged with a lot of people. So we've had a lot of discussions with our leadership teams, our HR teams, our HSE, our risk people, people who run the systems, etc. And through that process, we've also done a lot of I would say education, but it's also been two-way discussion. And so this map, even which was just the first stage before we assess, you know, what's in the documents and does it actually line up, that discussion has helped us build more to that as well. So, you know, there's people saying, well, what about that? What about how you're integrating environment and safety and so forth? And what about this piece? And HR, we've got this other system that we're building, and then getting those side conversations happening. So we've got to have some deeper conversations by virtue of even just starting this process and actually getting people thinking more deeply about how do I apply that in an investigation. And we already see that quality building in our investigations and so forth as we do that. So I think you do need to drive that deeper thinking and discussion and that reflection. You've got to be open to it. If you're doing it from a perspective of, I'm going to defend my system, or I'm going to prove that my system is a highly reliable organisation, then I think you're wasting your time. So we really need to actually be quite open to, I want to learn, I want to be curious, I want to know what things this teaches me that I don't know, where I might have gaps, where I might have even just missed a whole area as well. So I guess I wanted to say that is that process is as important as your output in terms of that leadership alignment and deepening the thinking on that piece as well. So, great, that's probably all I have at this stage. Thanks. Sorry, there was one more aspect to where we looked at which elements of that sort of enhancing and reducing variation as well, because it is a balance.
So I think this gave us a great jumping off point with some of the background about you know, what high reliability organizations are and some of the process there. And then the first question I want to ask you, Susan, is what process do you use to establish your baseline?
I think Bobby was getting to this as well. A process that is going to genuinely give you the information that you need must involve listening to people. That's the first obvious thing to say. So no incredibly well-designed corporate office exercise that doesn't involve listening to people in terms of how things are really operationalised will work. So from our perspective, one of the things that we've just recently tried at a mine site, which shall remain nameless in Queensland, was indeed a HRO baseline assessment. That's the first real one I think that's been done. And the fascinating part about that was that by taking some of the questions that we needed to have answered to form a view about sensitivity to operations or different expertise and turning them into tailored questions for each area and each level across the mine site. So you're obviously not going to go to an operator and say, hey, what do you think about this difference to expertise, right? You've got to think about what's the information I need from each group at a site or in an organisation that will allow me to answer that broader question. So we had a go at that. And we did that, as I say, by level, by area, quite a large exercise. And we also gave people an opportunity, just in case we were over-engineering it, to tell us what we didn't already have on our radar. So, you know, what haven't we talked about is, I think, the best question in this exercise ever. Because every time I've ever done a safety-related review and you end with that question, somebody comes up with something you've never heard of or thought about before, and you're back on your haunches going, holy hell, you know, that's significant. So a little bit of directed questioning, a little bit of open questioning, and obviously a lot of review of actual documentation so we match it up. So it's not just it's not a popularity contest. It's a probing exercise. But whatever methodology you use, you've got to build in that ability for people to tell you things that you don't already know. One of the things that I find quite frustrating at times with some of the processes people are thinking about utilising is it's all very, very directed. You know, I think my problem is this, so I'm going to go and ask everybody to validate what I already think my problems are. And what have you learned? Not a great lot. So openness, questioning, engagement, listening. And, you know, is it possible to synthesize, I can't even say the word, synthesize that down into some clarity about the state of play? Yes, we've just done it. I think it is. I think it's entirely possible to say if we collect information that covers these questions, can we form an evidence-based view? Yes, we can.
And so with that, the talking to everyone on all those different levels, the connections. Alex, so what is that connection between HROs and good leadership?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, you can't you can't have HROs without leadership, and they're a product of it. And again, if you have poor leadership, and leadership is effectively just about creating high functioning groups, you can't have high reliability. So I think that's a kind of basic point. Just to sort of elaborate on, because the point that Susan made there, because it's really worth underlining is, and I'm just sort of backtracking and contextualizing what I went off that little bit of a rant on checklists. That wasn't deliberate. But the point there isn't that checklists are kind of wrong in themselves, or even what the things they contain are wrong. It's that actually the answers you get to them are meaningless, because they're so riddled with like demand characteristics. So you look at those things and it's like, do you behave in a safe way, or do you check these things? Well, when you give those to people, of course they're going to say yes, of course they do, because they're going to say, well, what's the answer that you want, and then they give it to you. So again, you're never actually hearing people's voices, or actually what they really think. And then if you don't know what they really think or what they're really doing, then you've got nowhere to start, if you like. So you just and that's really the problem with those things. And as far as I can see, and I don't mean to disparage it, but the mining industry is just riddled with these things, which are like, they're just like demand characteristics on legs, wall-to-wall demand characteristics. Well, this is if you wouldn't get away with that in the other walk of life, like, no, I really don't need to know what you think. And just say after me, oh, we are behaving safely, isn't really a way to get that. So I don't mean.
I'd like to jump in and defend the mining industry and say it's been sold a lot of crap over the years.
Absolutely, So no, absolutely, it's been very poorly served by psychologists and the like. So I wouldn't. I mean, what I was saying, there is a sort of, has grown up in this space, which is also interesting to come at from. There is a sort of high reliability industrial complex, which is really around the commodification of solutions and and consultancy kind of products, again, which I absolutely understand how that's developed, because it's in every walk of life now. We got a problem, we'll hire some consultants, they come up with solutions, everybody else is using them, so we should use them, because that provides with a particular cover and a certain amount of safety, as it were, protection from litigation, but it doesn't really necessarily allow you to get to the bottom of the problem. And again, I'm much more with Susan, like, no, external parties are never really going to be the people who are going to solve the problem for you. You have to have those external parties help you to get to the bottom of the problem by working with your workforce. So these always have to be internal solutions. They have to be within the teams. They have to be owned by the people who are delivering on them. And I think that's another huge issue in this space.
And you mentioned, the checklist and everything that can, and the commodification that can disrail some of the journey towards the HROs. Bobby, would you like to tell us a bit more about some of the other enablers and derailers along the journey?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I think in the enabler space, probably we're going to sound like we're all singing from the same song sheet here. Very much it's in that leadership space. So leadership commitment to actually follow this process and have a look at it in the first place, it would be number one. I think there's a piece around what beliefs leadership have and how we want to actually do that. So if you have a belief that you know best and you're going to talk down to everybody else and they need to do what you say, you're probably not going to get very far. So I think one of the enablers is more of a collective leadership that is actually servant leadership in service of the front line, so that we're actually understanding that our role as leaders is to serve the front line and make sure their work is actually safe and they've got the tools that they need and the time that they need and the resources and so forth. If we're thinking about it the other way around, that my demand is more important on them than how we actually help them, then we've probably got it wrong from the first place. The other piece that's also about leadership that I think goes just a little bit deeper, or what needs to be in place first, what Susan was saying about listening to people, is that people, even when you are sitting down and listening to them and so on, they will still, if they don't feel that it's a psychologically safe environment and they've not had that in the past, or they come from a particular group within the workforce, such as contractors or a minority group or some other piece where they're not fully included, they actually still won't tell you what they really think. They'll tell you still what they think is safe to say, or what, and you won't get to the undiscussables and so forth. So I think that's where the work we're doing on psychological safety is aimed. So There's sort of 4 key components to psychological safety around, firstly, safe to belong. So how included do people feel in the conversation? And you know, how do we actually create that environment? So if we only include permanent people and not contractors, or if we only include the people who've been there a long time, or the people that we chat to at the pub afterwards, all the other aspects around inclusion, diversity, those sorts of things, we're not going to get very far. So first we have to make it safe to belong. Then we have to make it safe to contribute. So when people actually raise something, are we, you know, what's our response to that? Because everybody else is watching the response to that person. If they're shut down, even if you think it's a really silly idea, actually drawing that out, how you respond to it, how you use that information, sends a really strong signal to other people about whether or not it's safe for them to contribute. Then we have a piece on, you know, is it actually safe to learn? Can I put something out there? Can we innovate? Can we actually try things? What happens if we fail? You know, am I sacked if I fail? Am I, you know, or is it seen as a learning opportunity and I'm actually the person that can then help teach us how to do that more safely? And then you get to the safe to speak up. I think that's the 4th one. I think we start with safe to speak up. Why won't people speak up? So speaking up to me on that 4 quadrant for psychological safety is actually the undiscussables, the stuff that's really hard, the things that they think you don't want to hear. And that is where you get into the how does it really happen? How does it happen at 3 a.m? How does it happen on the back shift? Those sorts of things. So I think, you know, we can do a review and we will on, you know, how effective is our system. But that'll only get us a certain level, and then there will be layers that we have to get to, and depending on how safe people feel is how much information I'll share on that as well. So I think the short answer, which wasn't very short to your question, is psychological safety is quite key as an enabler as well.
Just like a kind of back because I think that's absolutely right. There's a great paper that's been published actually in Europe from colleagues of ours in sport, elite sport, and what they found was that one of the critical outcomes of identity leadership was precisely creating psychological safety. So that's all about leadership, about the way in which you manage that collective sense of self. And that in those elite sport teams, actually, yeah, you have really good high levels of identity leadership, but then that creates the psychological safety because people have all of those things. They feel it's safe to belong, safe to speak out, etc., safe to fail.
I think I didn't really touch on the derailers. A checklist approach is probably one of them. So that was probably one of the first ones. I think the second is that, you know, thinking that it's just a one and done kind of thing, which is what Alex is kind of partly saying with the checklist. And also thinking that you can just buy it in from the passing snowball salesman. You've actually got to do the work yourself. And I think you can get people to help you do the work, which is what Alex was saying as well, but you will need to do that work. So I think if you don't want to do the work, then probably don't start it because that will be quite a derailer from that side. I think a hierarchical or autocratic leadership style that isn't actually open to hearing from people and learning from people is also a big derailer.
Yes, so psychological safety is definitely important and taking them along on the journey. Are there other ways to get employees involved in the journey towards an HRO?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that we don't explore often enough is bringing people into the conversation rather than seeing them as an object of the conversation. So, you know, if I'm out there asking you some questions, you know, in a way, no matter how comfortable I can make you, no matter how much you trust me, no matter how confident you are about how I'm going to treat the information that you give me, I'm still making you're still the object of this conversation. I'm still interrogating you in some form or another. Try to make it as nice as possible, Nikki, but it's still happening. Being able to say to people, okay, look, we'd really like to talk with you about what you see as current issues and make that a much more interactive exercise. So baselines are important. But when you're trying to move from the baseline to whatever might be the first rung on your own particular organisational journey model, a collaborative approach to the improvement is, I think, incredibly important. Because what's happening here are two things. Ideally, is two things. You're actually making some sort of a specific change, but you're bringing everybody along in the process of making the change. And that sense of, oh God, I'm actually being listened to and I'm involved in this, and isn't this pretty good, is incredibly important to the next step. And I don't think that's done enough. So, you know, in my 5 minutes, I've focused on a point in time, which is the baseline. But the other conversation that we really should be having is about how do you, once you've done that, make the changes, which you see is important. And bringing, you know, we're talking about shared senses of purpose and so on. We only get that when you're genuinely willing to spend time developing those discussions and those relationships internally. This stuff is hard work, and I take Bobby's point about one of the things that is enormously frustrating to me and has been over quite a long time is this idea that if we just do this thing, it's done. Right? Oh, thank God for that. We got that over and done with. And at the next year's safety conference, we'll talk about something else. If we are not talking about this as an ongoing exercise for the next 10 years, we'll fail. Because it is a long-running process involving ongoing change. Well, in the work that we've done so far, we talk a lot about reliability-seeking organisations, and that's because I think, honestly, that's the most realistic way to describe it. We're not going to be sitting in front of a group of HROs this time next year. Ideally, we're going to be sitting in front of a group of people who are on a reliability-seeking kind of journey.
Yeah, so we've talked about moving the employees up the rung in that journey. How do we move the leaders up the rungs?
Well, again, you know, you've got to, you know, as an organisation, you kind of got to want to go on that journey too. I mean, I guess and this is generally true in the leadership space. I think there's some people who get this, and this is true across all industries. I think who get this kind of point, the inclusive, participative. It's about us, not about me. But there's also an awful lot of leadership stuff where it's really all about me. You know, and there's quite a lot of appetite for that in certain quarters. So there is resistance to that, and there are people who, you know, a basic observation is that, you know, an interest in leadership is very highly predicted by narcissism. You know, and we create lots of space in the leadership community for narcissists. You know, so you know, if that's a part of the way that we design everything we do, well, don't be surprised if you end up being run by narcissists who don't really get what we're talking about. So you know, how do you do that? I think it's really interesting. So the two types of organisations we've done most of the research probably are around highly effective organisations. They're in the military and in sport actually. And one of the reasons I think that they kind of get the message that we put across is because in those organisations, they actually really want to succeed. They really want to be highly reliable. They really don't want people to get killed on the battlefield, and they really do want to win the competition. Actually, I think in lots of organisations, people have very mediocre aspirations, and as long as they come out of it with a fistful of dollars, everything's just fine. You know, and so do you really want to this? Well, you know, or do you just want to, you know, go on to your next squishy job, you know, after this, have another line on your CV? And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in a lot of leadership positions in Australia who belong in the latter category, I would suggest.
So it's the question of what you do, though. If you happen to work, and I'm not suggesting anybody online or in the room does, but if you happen to work in an organisation which has its fair share of narcissists and people who are time serving, how do you then approach? Well,
it's it's a huge challenge, isn't it? So that's a bit of a derailer, as Bobby was saying. I mean, I think, you know, and again, I think one thing is that's one of those structural impediments. Be realistic about what you're going to achieve in that space. But you know, I think we as the population, you know, should demand better leaders, and we should also put ourselves in the way of better education and better developmental products in that space too, and not fall into that particular trap. So I do think there's an educational piece here too. And I also think actually it's really interesting because I think the leadership sort of industry, I think there's a widespread recognition that this is not that particular model has got us into a lot of problems. It's really interesting. Just one very simple example of that. If you look at COVID, the countries that have done well in managing COVID, a big predictor of that, of not doing well, was leader narcissism, like Trump or Johnson. If you had a leader who's just interested in, you know, doing, you know, saying what a wonderful leader I am, that wasn't really going to be the thing that's going to fix it for you. You look at the Scandinavian countries and so on, New Zealand or whatever, you know, they've had a very different model of leadership. Often, interestingly, women have been in charge who have got and tuned in much more to the kind of we dimension of it all. Well, you know, again, so again, you'd think that COVID would be a thing that would mobilize people to find a solution, but Well, not always, no.
And I think if you've got the narcissists right at the top, talking about, running a country or whatever, I think, you've got that piece where the leaders of tomorrow will be the leaders that we're growing up today. So most people in this room, on the call, whatever, we have an opportunity to help shape the leaders of the future as well, that are not of that ilk, and actually teaching people a different way. So I think if you've grown up looking up to the wrong kind of leader, the leaders that are very self-interested and don't actually have people's best interests at heart, that's what a leader looks like to you. You think, oh, that's what I have to be like to get ahead. And sometimes we actually need to make that really clear to people in mentoring, coaching, etc., that actually that's not something to aspire to, and there is another way. So we actually have to teach people another way. Otherwise, that's the example. It's like kids, they'll it's the example that they actually see, that it's what they'll do. So I think we have to be clearer about that's not what we want, and then we have to follow through with our actions on who we promote and who we actually bring through and what we reward as well. Because people, if you're saying no, that's not the kind of leader to be, but you're still rewarding people that are behaving in that way, then you won't change anything.
I think that rather than seeing this as something to be depressed about, the other thing that's worth remembering is you've got a sphere of influence, right? And you can influence and you can be engaged with your own teams. And within that boundary, are you able to change outcomes? Yes, I think there's ample evidence that that's entirely possible. So there are some things, depending on what level you're sitting at, you probably cannot shift, but there are others that you can. And if you're in that horrible situation of not being able to work constructively above you, then I think one of the things to logically think about is, okay, where does that lead? What is my scope for change? What can I actually do in my own space?
And there's a piece, I think, too, when you look at something like sensitivity to operations, which I think is one of the really key, they're all key, but that one I think is quite key. Otherwise, we're not listening to people, we're not actually giving them the space to do their work, etc. If you have got an organisation or a group or an area where there's unreasonable demands, particularly talking from above, sometimes not just from above, you can actually kind of umbrella that a little bit as well, and actually be the leader that's serving them as well. A bit road to walk, but it is quite worthwhile for the safety of the frontline folks as well.
Okay, so we know what kind of leadership we don't want in place for to become an HRO. So what does an organization need in place to start that journey?
Yeah, so I think we've discussed a bit of this, but it is that collective mindset and actually commitment to actually doing this as well. And I think that willingness to actually work in that way that we've talked about, from psychological safety, identity, leadership, there's quite a lot of overlap in some of those as well. And then I think the other thing that probably goes without saying for this particular audience, but I'll say it in case, if you have no systems at all, so if you're just kind of running, without management systems and so forth, then you probably need that as a bit of a foundation, I would think, before you're going to be able to do some of this as well. So.
Can I add that I think the fundamental characteristic that you also need is a willingness to be exposed, because how are you going to know where your real problems lie unless you're willing to have that unearthed and shared and talk about it? That takes leadership courage, particularly if you're reporting up to everybody that the world is running incredibly smoothly. Thanks very much. But unless you're willing to do it, you're not going to get the quality information that you need to make change.
I think if you're a senior leader, that is, so flipping it for a minute, assuming we've got senior leaders who also really want to learn and do things, if you're hearing that everything is always fine, thanks very much, then you should be concerned about that. We should be curious at least to say, okay, well, if that is really real, then you probably want to go and have a look at that, see if you can find it, see if you understand it. But if not, we should be curious about that and make sure we haven't got a situation where people don't actually feel it's safe to raise things.
Yeah, perpetually green traffic lights. Yeah, watch out for those. Never real.
Yeah, and again, I think actually that the light of day, sunlight is a very good thing. I think it's a good thing in all organisations. But I think, going back to the example, like sport is one of the reasons it's high reliable is you're on show all the time. And if you're underperforming, it's plain to see. And so and that, in a way that increases that concern for that. So I think openness, accountability is hugely important in that space. So I think that's true in all walks of life. And again, when you see bad leadership, whether it's in politics or whatever, it's typically just happening in dark places. And those people often, vehemently opposed to having sunlight shed on their activities. Why? Because well, they're not really going to withstand that. They're vampires.
I can see the headline, can't you?
Yeah.
Vampire
No, but I'm
leadership.
just saying. So I'm just saying that that is the thing, is that you don't want to be accountable. You don't want yourself to be exposed. So I think a first step point of call for an organisation is to want to know absolutely, dirt and all about where we're at, but you've got to create an appetite for that, and trust and all the things around that. That's not a straightforward thing to achieve.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anything from online?
There are a couple of questions online. I was just going to 3 questions online. Oh. So just trying to think how best to. I'm going to do a really low-tech way of getting these to you. No.
You can read them on the screen there.
Yeah, you can read them on the screen there. Actually, yeah.
I don't think, if I ask that first one, I don't think there's anything.
So the people online can't see them.
Okay, the question is, do you think there are fundamental elements in the social identity of the mining industry that help or inhibit the implementation of HRO? No, I don't think that can ever be true. There's nothing naturally that sort of inhibits you doing that. And interestingly, in the few things that we've done, it's very clear that there's teams and organisations that have absolutely worked out how to get this right. So it is, if you work at it and you want to achieve, you absolutely can. And all leaders and all organisations have some structural problems or challenges, and things that come up out of the blue that get in the way. But there's nothing. I don't think there's any firstly, natural impediment or insurmountable one. No, and I think that's true for any organisation. But it is this thing about, you absolutely have to understand that, and you have to have an on-the-ground understanding of what you're about. You can't just import some analysis and say, oh, this is going to fix it. So I think being clear about what the problems and the impediments you face are is important. But I think they're going to look, we've all said this, they're going to look different for every organisation. They're going to also look different in different parts of the organisation, different levels and so on. So you need that real fine-grained engagement with the content of identity to really find that out.
Can I just build on that and say, hi Bev, and say I agree. I don't think there are fundamental elements that in some way make it harder for mining. I mean, in my own personal career, the other 2 places I've worked in the most are health and politics. Trust me, mining is looking good. I mean, health is an incredibly autocratic environment where speaking up is very difficult if you're lower down the tree. I think for all the flaws that we can see in specific mines or specific circumstances, on the whole, this is an industry which is very open to learning, which is great. After all, this theory could be applied all over the place, but it's the mining industry that's talking about it. I think, despite the fact that some of it's challenging and it's not one size fits all and it's not just off the shelf and people can struggle a bit with that, I think the fact that there are so many conversations going on at the moment across the industry about high reliability is an incredibly positive sign. So I actually go the other way and say, I think more than many places that I'm certainly familiar with, there is an openness to thinking about what can be learned, what can be done differently, and that's great.
I think one of the other things, because Bev's question was what, anything fundamental that can help or hinder. I think some of the other things that actually are designed to help, and again, it's how we apply it and so forth. There are things in our legislation, when I look at the coal legislation, that are really sort of striving for some of that deference to expertise. So some of the statutory roles and some of the requirements of that, and trying to make sure that you have to listen to this person who knows about ventilation, or this person who knows about inspections underground and so forth. is quite helpful. And then there are things that are built in to try to actually overcome some of that safe to speak up. So there's avenues for complaints, there's an SSHR, etc. And sorry, I'm talking about the coal legislation, but there's similar things in the metals legislation as well. So you can see in that how it's designed and what's trying to be achieved actually is pretty compatible with it. It's sometimes how we actually apply that, and there's still barriers and so forth, but there are things where you can see things that are trying to help in that space.
That's a really interesting observation, and just for the sheer hell of it, I think I might now go back and have another look at legislation and compare it against HRO thinking and see where it leads us, because you're quite right. There's some statutorily enshrined components of engagement, consultation and discussion, which are all interestingly consistent. I suspect there are bits that aren't too.
Yeah, and I've worked in other jurisdictions where that's not as strong and it doesn't flow through in the same way. So I think specifically about things like SSHRs and some of the requirements around consultation that are actually enshrined into the legislation that are a little lighter on in legislation elsewhere. And so there's kind of a backstop where you can't proceed. You may not do it in the best way all the time consistently, but you have to try in our legislation here, versus some in, say, Western Australia is the other place that I've worked. It's lighter on some of that, and so then it's more up to whether or not companies want to do it. Interesting.
Yeah, good question, Bobby. Sharing about your journey. Sorry, my name is Ben Sally, and I'm from Mish. Yeah. You're sharing about your journey.
Yeah, so thanks. So if anyone didn't hear the question, it's, kind of what's next on the journey. So we've just finished the mapping piece. We've had, because I said you can take help from outside as well. So we've had people validate that and have a look at, does our map make sense? Where have we missed it, etc. So we will have some improvements from that. So that's the first draft that we'll share with you tonight as well. It was probably about draft 4, but it's prior to external validation. Then we want to actually have a look at, okay, what are those pieces that, how well are we going with that? And we can have a look at some of that, kind of self-assessing some of that as well. I think this is where we will probably look to have someone external help us with it, because we want to get to the unknown unknowns. So understanding some of the things we know might be opportunities for us. A lot of things that we talk about, like most people, you're on a journey with it. We haven't arrived yet, and I think we're very much in that mode of thinking about it being a reliability seeking organisation rather than a HRO. I think we'll never have actually arrived, because kind of, if almost by definition, if you think you have, then that's a big problem. So starting to look at some of those deeper questions, perhaps in the sensitivity to operations, but also we're a large and complex organisation. So I think the example that Susan gave earlier of the work that they've done at a mine site, that's great. But if we had Susan come do that for us, she'd probably be with us for 10 years. So we will need to kind of take more of a sample and have a look a little bit more deeply into that, and then have a look at, well, what does that tell us? Where else should we be curious? So I think there will be layers to that. Sorry, it's not a full answer, but that's some of that next piece. In the meantime, we are continuing the things that we already made longer term commitments to that are quite consistent with this. So field leadership programs and so forth, and continuing to improve and build those as we go. But we're not throwing everything out and starting again. We're actually trying to improve what we have. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The next one's more of a comment than a question, just about vaccine countries. There's another question that's come through, is how do teams limit the risk of members and leaders on the overconfident end of the Dunning-Kruger spectrum making poor decisions?
I think it's on for Alex.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the Dunning-Kruger effect is that it's something just code for just stupid people get to have a voice. There's actually no evidence in that. That's kind of what it means. I mean, so it's used to disparage people. But actually, there's not. It's a bit of a. It's not the actual evidence for the effect is actually pretty limited. So I think that a key thing is, I think I think that you need to be listening to everybody really, and just making sure that you're hearing everybody's views. And it's a bit the psychological safety thing that. You want to, even if people's thoughts on a particular topic might be kind of wacky, it's important for you to hear them and to see where they're coming from. And I think I've never been in all the stuff we've done, and I've worked in some pretty crazy places. there's never, I don't think there's any person or any group that's had something to say that has been, inherently worthless, if you see what I mean. So I think, again, I think even when people say things that aren't, that don't ostensibly look sensible, I think they often come from an interesting and important place. And so I think, I don't really like to divide the world up into smart people and stupid people and think that I only need to listen to the smart people. I think that's because that you may end up disappointed. Is kind of my thing. And also positioning people as stupid isn't really the way to get the best out of them. And again, I don't think that's the orientation of effective leaders. I think most effective leaders understand that everybody has a contribution to make and everybody needs to be heard and listened to. So I think that's really quite an important starting point.
Think of the risk that you're taking if you exclude. Think of the consequences of that. So if your aim here is high reliability, but also you don't want people to have accidents, hurt themselves, kill themselves. If you take a view that all I want to do is listen to those people because I already align closely with them and I think what they say makes sense.
Yeah.
And you've just excluded a proportion of your organisational population.
Yeah.
How exposed have you now been? Because there'll be motivations driving the people who've been excluded from the conversation that you really should be understanding. There'll be choices that they'll be making.
And you want, at the end of the day, you want everybody's buy-in anyway. And if they haven't been parted to the solution, it's very unlikely they'll be, that enthusiastic about it, however sensible inverted commas it is. So I think, that's an important part of the process.
I see someone has another question, but I just wanted to add, like in a practical sort of sense, I think you want to hear from everybody. So, and you take a practical sense of, say, a task-based risk assessment, like a JSA or JHA, whatever you call it at your site. If you sit back and watch some of the dynamics of that, sometimes you hear a couple of loud voices and they're always the same loud voices, and they may know lots of things, but there will be also others there that also need to participate in that job, need to understand it. They may be afraid to ask a question, afraid of being thought of as not being as smart or whatever. And I think it's up to us as leaders, if you're there at that, to actually sort of try to set that up in a different way so that you hear from other people. So a couple of things we've done in the psychological safety space is have the person who's the apprentice or whatever hold the pen on the JSA so that they actually get to be part of that and facilitate that piece and have to kind of understand it to translate it and write it down. Have somebody ask those folks. I was up in the field, a couple of weeks ago, and you saw it was a large group of people trying to work out how to do a particular job, and there were about 3 people at one end kind of shouting, and there were a lot of people that weren't saying anything. And there was a person that was kind of watching this, and there was a person in the middle that said, okay, well, who else is a rigger on that piece? Well, what else do you do? And there was information that the people that were doing the shouting didn't actually have, and the other people actually had a lot of information that could be fed into it, and it ended up with a better outcome and a better approach as well, because of making assumptions. So I think it's just important that if you're not hearing from everyone, why is that? Do they understand and actually doing that checking that, do they not feel like they can speak up? Do they not know? And therefore you might want to mix a little bit more of them before they start the job. But we need to hear from everyone, particularly in those smaller teams. So there's another question.
Hello. My name's Caroline Dunning. In sort of the same sort of vein as that last question, I've found there's sort of a tendency to promote like whoever's the loudest and not necessarily the person who actually knows anything technically or whatever. And then they'll limit what they tell their bosses. So by the time you get to a general manager of a mine, they have no idea what's realistically happening. And I guess the 2 parts of that is, how do you get around getting the people further up the chain to actually know what's really happening when they're getting such a sterilized message? And how do we promote people who aren't just the loudest person in the room?
I think that's a really key point. So I can start on that. That's one of the things that we've tried to do with the field leadership program is if we are relying on what people are told, then that's going to be a sanitized version of things, or sometimes what they think people want to hear, etc. So actually going out in the field and engaging directly, so that sort of sensitivity to operations piece, talking to the people who are doing the work, understanding how does this really work, creating that space where they can tell you, you know, what frustrates you, what are the things that you can't do or that are more difficult, etc., and understanding, you know, kind of what really happens. I think if you're in a senior leadership position on the mine side or something, and you're just relying on what people are telling you rather than going and looking and seeing, then you're probably not fulfilling all your obligations even. So I think there's that piece where, you know, it is incumbent on us to go and actually check. And then I think one of the other things that goes with that you're sort of getting to as well is sometimes that's, you know, that means going and doing fit leadership on the back shift and understanding some of those other pieces and so on that you may not otherwise see, rather than just going to the area that's right beside the office and it's easy to get to, for example.
And I don't think we should sugarcoat this. I mean, the industry still has its share of very hierarchical, shouty leaders. And Bobby's definitely not one of those. But in the industry, there still are, unfortunately, people who believe, and I don't want to get too direct about this, but who believe that if they're issuing you a set of instructions and you're following them absolutely, completely, perfectly, and raising no issues, it's a good day, right? That's how they see the world. And it's really difficult in that environment to get out the information, to be listened to be heard. So I think, you know, if you think about the HRO baseline conversation, one of the things that anyone who's conducting that kind of an exercise absolutely needs to do is to ensure that people are able to talk about what they see as important. And you know, in the exercise that we just did, for example, one of the questions that was raised with us is, well, why are you talking to that person? You know, well, why is that person on your list? That person doesn't run anything. That person, the person's on the list because the person's got something to say. So when you're constructing a process, you need to really think carefully about how you can ensure that the engagement isn't driven by some preconceived idea of value. You know, and unfortunately, I suspect that for some companies, engagement is driven by that. It's driven by, okay, if we really want to improve in this area, let's talk to these 10 people because we know they've got something to say about it. And they're doomed to only hear what they've always heard.
Yeah, it's great.
Hi. I just have one question. Our industry loves paperwork and we love sometimes solving things with paperwork. And as we go down this journey, and it can be quite a complex journey in many areas, how do you check that we're just not adding another trick to the tools or another tool, that we're actually checking that we're keeping the paperwork in line?
So just again, without answering that specific question, I just like the observation there is that, you know, the size of your manual, as it were, is normally negatively correlated with, you know, actually your ability to solve the problem. So if you solve the problems just by adding another chapter or another 100 pages, you know, but I think there's a sort of strange cycle that goes on there too, that you kind of, like organisations, they do, oh no, this is, so we'll add a bit more, and then there comes a point where people say, no, actually this is ridiculous because the manual's like too big. Nobody could ever possibly do that, and it couldn't possibly achieve the things that we wanted to do. So I do think, like, just being sensitive to like what's actually going on here, and like to what extent are people engaging with what we're saying here, and are they able to, is a really critical one, because obviously there is a sense in which, yeah, just manualizing it more, or adding more information in that space. It's not an information problem, it's a motivation problem.
If I can build on that, Kate, and say that one of the big advantages of fully understanding what high reliability organisations is all about is coming to that realisation, as Bobby was just talking about, there's a lot that's going on already that's directly relevant to it. So the idea that, you know, HRO is a new thing to bolt on to the other things is wrong. High reliability thinking encompasses a lot of what already goes on in the industry now, and being able to, organisation by organisation, look at what you have against those principles, and in some cases be very pleasantly surprised, I suspect. People going, oh, actually, we're already doing that. We didn't call it that, to take someone else's comment, but we're doing that. So So doing that mapping exercise is valuable on lots of different levels, one of which I think is reducing the likelihood you're just going to add several more layers of paper, because you'll fairly quickly, I think, see some things are already well covered, some will not be. And it's finding the sweet spot for each organisation and focusing. And I don't think it's an industry, well, for me anyway, it wouldn't be an industry-wide, as an entire industry, we must absolutely add on this bit because it's going to vary so much place by place.
Yeah, just another little micro observation there also. That type of solution can be a real problem. I know, you know, I've worked in organisations, you know, where we had a problem, like, you know, an ethics problem or something of this, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to make the ethics procedure much more, you know, challenging and much more rigorous, and there's going to be many hoops you have to jump through. Well, the fact of the matter is that just creates more problems for the people who were doing things ethically. The people who are doing things unethically are never going to read the manual anyway, so they're never going to do the usual things. So actually, you actually just handicap yourself more. And I think that's the people who need to get this message. It doesn't matter how much is in the manual; it's never going to matter to them. But the people who are diligently trying to do the right thing, you've just made their work harder. And that's some kind of crazy law in this space that it's really important to be sensitive to.
I think also if we get better quality investigations, which I think the HRO principles can help us get to, then we don't come up with an action that says write something more in the procedure because the person didn't follow the procedure. Instead of saying, you know, we documented a procedure that they couldn't possibly follow. They, you know, this required them to do 10 hours of work and we only allocated an hour, or we didn't give them the right tools or whatever. So we solve for what the real problem is. We're less likely to end up at it's a procedure gap, and therefore we need to add more pages to the procedure. And I think that procedure gap, sometimes that'll be the case, but I think it's too often the outcome when actually it's not actually the cause of the issue.
So if there's one industry-wide new thing, in my mind, it would be that people in their own ways, not being mandated on the detail by anybody, look at their organisations as they are right now and do that mapping. That would be significant if that was done properly, because that would then leave you with a whole set of revelations across the industry about where people stood. I don't know if it's a piece of paper, but it might be a broad process. Yeah, huge business.
Hi, Yas from BHP here. A lot of the things that I've heard you guys talk about tonight sound really similar to really good change management practices as well. And often I think, you know, not just in our industry, but any industry, when we have a problem, we want to put together some kind of plan on how to fix it. And it really becomes driven from like the more project management, technical kind of milestone, I guess, way. So my question is how can we as a, you know, industry that is so focused on that project management style be more deliberate around approaching not just this kind of, you know, trying to become a HRO, but every time we make a change and that kind of thing, to have that change management element and approach in partnership with the project management?
Great question. I think, you know, in the project management and change management improvement sort of space, you know, we think of things like Six Sigma models and there's other models, and so there's the technical side and then there's the acceptance side and that engagement side. And I think it, you know, there's a reason they kind of teach you that so much when you do that training, is because that's the piece that people either skimp or fall down on. And I think if we did every change properly and did all the engagement, we'd probably do fewer changes, and that would also probably be a good thing as well. But we're not spending enough time. The tools are there, the processes are there, you know, it takes more time than people think. And so I think whenever you hear the words like we're going to cascade a message or we're going to, you know, communicate a change, instead of like communicate is one step of it and cascade suggests a one-way flow, so we don't actually then hear what the problem is, etc., versus a whole kind of engagement and working with people, which is quite different. And, you know, as you know, yes, you've got it cascades, tends to suggest that I'm just telling one person, I'm not getting 3 or 4 crews that are on different back shifts and other pieces, and one of them gets a recorded message and doesn't even get a chance to ask a question. It actually takes a lot of time to do well, but I think it is really worth doing it well. And I think when we say, oh no, that takes too much time, so I can't do it because I've got to get on with the next one, we're actually trying to do too many changes at once sometimes as well.
One of my favourite quotes ever from many years ago is from a guy in mine in WA where he said, I was sick of being rolled over by all the stuff they're rolling out. And that was on a back shift late at night underground with somebody who was just over the endlessness of things being thrown at him. One of the HRO principles is reluctance to simplify, right? And what you've just triggered in me is what we've got to be super careful about here is we don't simplify this down to a project to be delivered. And Bev's query about, you know, what's enablers and so on. Well, actually, I think I might revise my answer. One of the factors that we need to deal with in the industry is the project mentality that you're talking about. I think that's a real thing to think through. So for me, what's the goal? Put aside the process for a moment. What's the goal? The goal is higher reliability. Okay, what does that mean? We say we want to do something and we actually get to do it organisationally. What is it that will give us the best understanding of where we're currently at? Maybe. What is it that will give us the best way to approach what we see as the areas that are currently negatively impinging on our reliability? And I think it's a thinking process rather than an immediate doing process. And I think you're raising a really good question and a really good challenge. How do we pull people back from the doing before they've done the thinking first?
Yeah, I mean, I just underline this point. I mean, there's in the organisational change literature, the sort of starting point for this discussion is always the observation that 80% of organisational change fails, like just straightforwardly fails. And why is that? Well, there's multiple overlapping reasons, but one is we just do too much of it for a start, so it couldn't possibly succeed. But also, often it just comes from the wrong place. Like people do change because that's the way they show their great leaders. Whereas actually, no, often if you're a great leader, you wouldn't change anything. You wouldn't structurally, you'd actually just be doing other things which would just help people to do what they're already doing. So I think, but a more particular reason why change fails is that it does violence to people's sense of identity rather than actually facilitating it. So actually, we just got a big review paper on this coming out, but that's really the point. And you take things that are working well. We did a study with the UK military where they took regiments and they, regiments have been around for like 300 years. And then they wanted to turn, all the Black Watch and all the other ones, they just turned them into the Scottish regiment because that made sense because there's all these small little regiments. And look, it would be so much more efficient if they were just called the Scottish regiment. Oh, that looks nice on a spreadsheet. Apart from the fact that you've got these units, these regiments that have got a very proud history of 300 years or more or whatever that people identify with, and that their parents or their family or their community were in. And if you just say, well, that doesn't matter because actually you're just Scottish or whatever it might be, and so on and so forth. Again, your motivations as a leader are really suspect. And if you think that's the way to get the best out of the people you're managing, you're deluded. So again, one of my other little observations here is, I think we see lots of dark forces in the world at large with, people's belief in, we were talking about before, conspiracy theories and crazy stuff like that. But I think a lot of those people who have those views are just people who've been on the wrong end of too much crap organizational change, and they've lost a sense of like a grip on reality. They've been bruised by the system. They don't feel they belong. They don't think the world cares about them. They think all these experts are just some group of elites who treat them as pawns to push them around on the chessboard. Well, if you create a world in which that's real, don't be surprised if you end up with a deeply cynical workforce and a deeply cynical population.
Wouldn't it be great if you went through the whole exercise of trying to assess where you're currently at and you thought, actually, there's only 1 or 2 things that would really make a difference? That's what I'm thinking. But let's spend some time working with the people who are involved and see if that's what they're thinking as well. And let's work out collectively how to do something.
I've just got to tell one really interesting story now. So we did some work in television actually with and production companies, and I remember talking to one guy, and he was the CEO of a big company, in the UK, and he'd been in his job for like 10 years, and the standard time in that industry was 2 years. And I said to him, like, so what is the secret of your success? You know, what do you put it down to? And he said, I did nothing. I just listened to people day in, day out, and just heard what they had to say. He said, it's just amazing how powerful that is. And I never was trying to like impose myself, never trying to change anything. And I thought, well, some days it's got to end because people are going to fly me out because I'm not doing this leadership stuff. but bizarrely, everything just went swimmingly. He's a very famous television director, and he commissioned all this industry. He was the head of Channel 4, and they commissioned things like Come Dine With Me and Loose Women. I don't know if you know these television programs in the UK. So these really wacky things. Again, they changed a lot of the genre of television. All he was doing was just listening to these ideas coming through the system and not trying to impose his idea for what creativity would look like in this space. And I think there's an awful lot to learn from that very simple story.
Yeah, I'd probably add to that in the change piece. If you can get things that, you know, are well designed, make a longer term commitment to them. So I think, you know, and Yaz, you'd be aware that like our field leadership program within BHP, we've had a number of programs that tended to come and go as you got a new global head of safety or whatever, where they develop a new program that looked fairly much like the old program, but it's called something different and it swapped and it changed and so forth. And we've got operators who've been with our business for 40 years. And you get a new leader in every 2 years or 3 years that says, this is the way. Now you get behind me, this is the way. And the operator says, well, I'm just going to kind of shrug and kind of pretend for a while until you go and then the next person, because they've seen it all before. Whereas if you can make a long-term commitment, so when we actually got, okay, well, here's a program that, you know, a similar iteration had been around the business before, we're actually going to make a long-term commitment to it. And we settled on 20 years. And I think our Mitsubishi friends said, probably we've had the same principles for 150 years. 20 years is not a long time. So, you know, that was some good counsel as well. But it was a long enough period that people had to go, right, I don't get to come in now and put in the Bobby Foot program and put that on my CV, as you say, or whatever. So some of it is about ego. Is what you've got actually broken? If it is, by all means, then change it. But otherwise, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Have a look at what you've got and go, right, how do I make this work better? Same with organisational change and so on. You know, sometimes it needs to be done. Sometimes you could probably just work with what you have as well and cause a lot less disruption.
Okay, well, that's our time there. So can we give our speakers a round of applause? Very enlightening and entertaining discussion tonight. So I hope everybody learned a few things. I certainly did. No checklists and narcissistic leaders, but also some very good things on psychological safety as well. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight and thank everyone online for being there as well. So, this was sponsored by the AusIMM Southern Queensland branch, the AusIMM Health and Safety Society, and the Minerals Industry Safety and Health Center within the Sustainable Minerals Institute here at the University of Queensland. So, thank you to those groups for helping put this evening together. I think it's been a really great talk, and I'm glad we could have it as a hybrid online for those of you who aren't in Brisbane as well. I'll leave it there. Thank you.